There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when a princess stops being a title and becomes a person. When she leans forward in a plastic chair in a community room in the north of England, not because a camera is waiting, not because a speech is scheduled, but because an elderly man sitting across from her just said something that made her laugh, a real laugh, the kind that catches in the throat before the face catches up. That is the moment nobody plans for in a royal itinerary. And that is exactly the kind of moment that happened on the 27th of January, 2026, when Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked into the DIY Kitchen Stadium in Wakefield and made a rugby league club feel like the most important place in England. This story is not really about royalty. It is about what happens when power, real, formal, hereditary power, decides to sit down at the same table as loneliness. It is about an 80-year-old man who used to play on that very pitch, who now comes to the stadium not to watch a game but to feel less alone. It is about a 15-year-old girl from Pontefract who was heading somewhere bad and got redirected by a rugby ball and a program that believed in her before she believed in herself. It is about a group of young girls on a frost-bitten pitch who heard a princess joke that rugby league is the only sport where you are actually encouraged to make contact and who laughed with her, not at her. This is the story of what community looks like when someone finally shows up to say it matters. It started early that Tuesday morning, when Catherine left London and headed north. January in Yorkshire carries a particular kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of mountains or coastlines, but the steady, grey, get-inside kind of cold that makes warm rooms feel earned. The princess had a full day of engagements planned across the north of England, and Wakefield was the second stop. Before arriving at the stadium, she had spent the morning at a children's trauma therapy centre in Bradford, where she sat with young children aged between 4 and 18, watching how therapists used creativity and play to help them process things that should never happen to children. She had held a small seashell to a 5-year-old girl's ear and taught her to listen to the sea. She had spoken with a 12-year-old boy who told her he had found healing in drumming because he liked instruments he could smack, and she had understood that entirely, responding warmly that expressing yourself through something physical was a powerful way to manage the kind of feelings that words cannot always carry. By the time she arrived at Wakefield, the day had already carried more emotional weight than most people's entire weeks. But she walked through the doors of that stadium with the same openness she had carried into the morning. This was not performance. It was consistency, the particular kind that is harder to fake than a smile. Wakefield Trinity is not a glamorous club in the way that certain football institutions market themselves as glamorous. It does not have the name recognition of clubs from larger cities, does not carry the commercial weight of those broadcast in prime time across the world. What it has is something arguably rarer. It has roots. The kind that go down deep into the soil of a community and hold. The club has been part of Wakefield's identity for well over a century, and in that time it has seen the town change around it, industries come and go, neighborhoods shift, generations grow old. The stadium itself had recently undergone renovations, and there was a visible pride in it that day. Clean lines, well-kept spaces, the kind of investment that says we are not going anywhere. Craig Barris, the club's chief executive officer, was among those waiting to welcome the princess. He had said beforehand that the visit was an immensely proud day for everyone connected to the club, and, standing there watching the arrival, it was clear that was not a polished line for the press. The staff, the volunteers, the community workers who ran the programs being showcased that day, they all carried themselves with a particular kind of excitement that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with validation. For years, these people had been doing work that largely went unseen beyond the boundaries of the district. Hosting the Princess of Wales meant that the rest of the country might finally look. The first thing Catherine did when she arrived was not attend a formal reception or sit through a presentation. She went straight to the people. The In Touch program had gathered a group of regular participants in one of the stadium's community spaces, and this was the room she entered first. In Touch is run by the Wakefield Trinity Community Foundation, the club's charitable arm, and its purpose is straightforward in its description and profound in its effect. It creates open, welcoming spaces for elderly members of the local community to spend time together, to take part in quizzes and workshops and stadium tours, and to simply exist in a place where people are glad to see them. The participants that day ranged in age from their 60s to their 90s. They had come expecting a quiz. They left having spent the afternoon with the future Queen of England. Among the group were two men who had a particular connection to the space they were sitting in. Neil Fox and Jeff Oakes, both former Wakefield Trinity players, had returned to the stadium many times over the years, but their relationship to it had changed in the way that time changes all relationships. They were no longer men and kid on a pitch. They were men in chairs in a warm room, and the program that had brought them there had given that warm room meaning. When Catherine sat with them, she was not sitting with sports legends, though they were that too. She was sitting with men who understood something she had spoken about publicly and, personally, that isolation, at any age, is one of the quiet crises that the world is not very good at naming. She had spent much of her public work in recent years focused on early childhood development and mental health, and in those men's faces she could see the same need she had seen in the children in Bradford that morning. The faces were different. The need was the same. They had a heritage quiz that afternoon, the kind that sparked memory rather than demanding it, that gave people an excuse to lean over and say, "Do you remember that match, or wasn't that the year we?" The princess joined in with the kind of ease that either comes naturally or takes years of practice, and, in her case, it appeared to be both. She asked questions that showed she had done her homework. She understood the history of rugby league, understood what the club meant to the town, and understood that the men and women sitting around her were not just program participants. They were living archives. They were Wakefield. She leaned forward at one point and told them something that those in the room would remember long after the cameras were gone. She told them that the league game, being so embedded in community life, so rooted in grassroots connection, in the way it brought youngsters in but also connected the whole of the community together, that clubs like this were absolute gold dust. She said she was proud to support the league across the country. The room was quiet for a moment, not the awkward quiet of people unsure how to respond, but the full quiet of people who felt heard. Gold dust. 2 words. Enough. There is a particular kind of work that gets done in rooms like this, in programs like In Touch, that is easy to overlook precisely because it is not dramatic. Nobody is being saved from a burning building. Nobody is making a headline-grabbing intervention. What is happening is smaller than that and larger than that at the same time. An elderly person comes to a rugby stadium on a Tuesday afternoon because someone will be there who knows their name. Someone will save them a chair. Someone will argue with them about whether a quiz answer is right. And, in that ordinary friction of a Tuesday afternoon, something that was slowly closing off in that person, the sense that the world still had room for them, that they were still connected to something larger than their own 4 walls, opens again. Just a little. Just enough. Catherine understood this. Not academically, not as a policy position, but, in the room, in the conversation, in the way she gave each person in that circle her actual attention rather than her managed attention. There is a difference, and most people can feel it immediately. She stayed longer than the scheduled time in that session. Not because she had to. Because the conversation had become too real to leave on a clock. What happened in that room in the first part of the afternoon at Wakefield Trinity was, in the truest sense, a celebration of something that modern life consistently undervalues and, then, wonders why it loses. The thing it loses is this: the experience of being known. Of belonging to a place that expects you back next Tuesday. Of sitting across from someone who says your name with warmth and means it. The In Touch program, in its own modest way, was doing the work that governments commission reports about and charities fundraise for and politicians reference in speeches. Except it was actually doing it, in this room, with these people, on this cold January afternoon. And, now, because of who had come to sit in that circle, the rest of the country might finally understand what it had been missing. The princess had called them gold dust. And, the people in that room, the volunteers, the elderly participants, the former players, the community workers, had spent years knowing it. It had just taken a Tuesday in January for someone with a platform to say it out loud. After the In Touch session, Catherine moved through the stadium and the afternoon shifted. The warmth of the community room, the quizzes, the laughter, the steady rhythm of older people telling their stories, gave way to something with more edge. In a dugout along the side of the pitch, a different group was waiting. Younger. Quieter. The kind of quiet that is not peace but the careful holding back of too much feeling in a space where they were still deciding whether to trust it. This was the Inspiring Futures program. And this is where the afternoon became something else entirely. Inspiring Futures is not the kind of program that gets described easily in a brochure. The name suggests hope, which is accurate, but the work itself begins somewhere harder than hope. It begins in the places where young people are already being written off. These were teenagers from Wakefield and the surrounding areas who had been identified as being at risk. At risk of exclusion. At risk of antisocial behavior. At risk of the particular trajectory that begins with small decisions made in difficult circumstances and ends with futures that nobody would have chosen for them. The program, funded through the Youth Endowment Fund and delivered centrally by the RFL Social Impact Team in partnership with the RFL Community Trust, operates across 11 professional rugby league foundations and reaches thousands of youngsters through around 100 schools. Its method is direct: take the discipline and teamwork built into the sport and use it as a framework for building the internal skills, goal setting, stress management, emotional regulation that formal education does not always have time or structure to teach. It works because it meets young people where they already are, rather than asking them to become someone else first. The students from the King's School in Pontefract who were part of the group that afternoon had already been through a version of the program. They were not there as cautionary tales. They were there as evidence. The evidence that something had shifted, not fixed, not resolved, not completed, but shifted, in the way that matters most. The kind of shift where a young person looks up instead of down, makes eye contact instead of avoiding it, says something in a group and, then, feels surprised by the confidence it took to say it. Catherine sat in the dugout with them. The dugout is one of the more quietly significant locations in any sports ground. It sits between the pitch and the crowd, between performance and observation, and it asks everyone inside it to focus on what happens next. She was dressed in a smart jacket and trousers, not dressed for training, not dressed in any of the protective layers of formality that royal engagements usually demand. She sat with them the way a person sits, not the way a figurehead sits, and she asked questions. She asked about the program. She asked how it had helped. She listened to the answers with the particular quality of attention that young people, who are extremely good at detecting its absence, immediately recognize as real. These were not teenagers who had grown up expecting to be listened to. The program had given them a space in which listening was the baseline, and now here was the Princess of Wales holding that same baseline with the same steadiness. What she heard was this: that rugby league had given them a structure when structure had been in short supply. That the coaches who ran the Inspiring Futures sessions had offered them something different from the standard transactional relationship of authority, not telling them who to be, but showing them they already had the materials to figure that out. That goal setting, which sounds like a workshop exercise, had in practice become something much more personal. The act of writing down what you want and, then, being held gently accountable to it by someone who actually reads what you wrote, that small ritual had for some of these young people been the first time in their lives that their future had felt like something they were constructing rather than something that was happening to them. None of them said all of this in those exact words. They were teenagers in a dugout in January. But the shape of it was there in what they did say, in the way they said it, in the fact that they were sitting in a dugout willingly, having a real conversation with a woman they had been told was important, and not performing nervousness or boredom or any of the other standard defenses young people reach for when they feel they are being assessed. They were present. That was itself the thing. Mark Lovering, the RFL's Director of Performance and Development, had been with the princess throughout the afternoon, walking her through the scope of what the foundation had built. He spoke about the positive social impact of the sport with the particular conviction of someone who had watched the numbers on paper become real people making real changes in real communities. Thousands of youngsters. 11 foundations. 100 schools. Those are large numbers, but numbers do not sit in dugouts. Numbers do not walk into stadiums and choose to stay. The people who run these programs understand that every statistic they can present is a person who, at some point, came through a door like the one these teenagers had come through, uncertain of the welcome, uncertain of the point, and found, on the other side, something worth staying for. Catherine told them she was proud of them. She did not make it sound like a line. It did not land like a line. It landed the way things land when they are true, slightly heavier than expected, taking a moment to settle. After the dugout session, the afternoon moved outward, literally. The stadium grounds led to the pitch, and the pitch, that afternoon, was busy. The champion schools competition had brought girls' teams from local schools to take part in a skills session, and the pitch was full of movement, the particular beautiful chaos of a group of young people who have not yet learned to be self-conscious about trying hard. They ran drills. They dropped the ball and chased it. They tackled each other with the exuberant aggression of people who have been told that in this context, that aggression is not only acceptable but encouraged. Catherine walked onto the pitch and into this. She was, as she noted with a laugh, not exactly dressed for it. She held a rugby ball, turned it in her hands, and let the girls carry on their session while she moved through them, pausing to watch, pausing to talk. The girls, who were somewhere between flustered and determined not to show it, kept playing. Which was exactly right. She asked one group about the sport, about their schools, about how they had got involved. One of the girls mentioned Princess Charlotte, perhaps because Charlotte was roughly in their orbit of age, perhaps because a princess in a conversation about sport prompts a reference to another princess. Catherine answered simply, honestly, with the specific detail that Charlotte did loads of sport but not rugby. It was the kind of small domestic sentence that cuts straight through the distance between royalty and ordinary life, the kind of detail that makes the woman instead of the title visible, and the girls responded to it with the laughter of recognition. Oh, she is also a mother whose daughter has a schedule. She said something else to the girls that none of them will easily forget. She told them that rugby league is the only sport in which you are actively told that contact is a good thing. She said it with the timing of someone who had clearly said it before and found it to be reliable, and the girls laughed, and the coaches nearby laughed, and for a moment the pitch felt less like a ceremonial visit and more like a training session that happened to have slightly unusual participants. But underneath the laughter, something else was being said. Catherine had spent the year since her cancer diagnosis speaking, with increasing directness, about vulnerability. About the importance of not pretending. About what it means to be genuinely present in your life rather than performing your way through it. And, here on a pitch in Wakefield, surrounded by young girls who had come to a rugby competition on a school day in January, the subtext of the joke carried its own weight. Contact is a good thing. Showing up is a good thing. Being in the arena, making the tackle, getting up off the ground, not as metaphor but as practice, and not just in sport. The girls felt it, even if none of them could have named exactly what they were feeling. They would tell their parents that evening that the Princess of Wales had come to their competition and that she was really cool about it. Which is a 13-year-old's way of saying she did not make us feel small. She made us feel like we were doing something that mattered. And the truth is they were. The Champion Schools competition, which runs through dozens of schools and gives girls pathways into rugby league that did not exist in the same form a generation ago, is one of those quiet engines of change that operates without ceremony. Girls who grow up playing competitive sport in teams develop a set of skills and a sense of themselves that carries forward in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. They learn to trust their bodies. They learn to read a situation fast and commit to a decision. They learn that failure in a physical game is temporary and that the best response to it is to get back into position. They learn that other people's success does not diminish their own. These are lessons that cost money to teach in corporate workshops to adults who have spent 20 years without them. Here they were being taught for free, by a sport that demands them, to girls who came out in the cold because they loved the game. The Princess of Wales, standing at the edge of that pitch in the January air, watched them and called them gold dust too, in her own way. Not the same words she had used inside, but the same feeling. The same recognition. The same refusal to pretend that what was happening here was small. It was not small. None of it was. At the end of a royal visit, there is always a gift. Protocol requires it. A token is selected, presented, received with gracious words, and photographed. Most gifts live out the rest of their days in the careful storage of a palace inventory. This one was different. Mike McMeekin, England player and captain of Wakefield Trinity, and Caitlin Varley, his co-captain, stood together on the pitch and presented Catherine with a Wakefield Trinity shirt. It was the club's shirt, their colors, their badge, their name across the back. McMeekin had already said that day that talking to the princess about the club, about what it did on and off the field, had felt genuine, that she had been genuinely curious, genuinely interested, not performing curiosity in the way that visitors sometimes do when they come to events like this and need to fill the minutes between arrival and departure with something that looks like engagement. This had been actual engagement. And so the shirt was not a formality. It was an offer of membership. McMeekin said that now she had it, she was an honorary member of the club. She took that seriously. Or at least, she received it seriously, which is the thing that matters in moments like this. She held the shirt and she looked at it the way you look at something that has been given with meaning, and the exchange had the quality of a real transaction rather than a ceremony. A club giving its colors to someone it wants to keep. A person accepting those colors because she understands what they represent. What they represented, by the end of that afternoon, was something that had been building through every room and every conversation and every cold minute on that pitch. Wakefield Trinity, the club, the foundation, the people who give their time to it, represented a specific kind of refusal. A refusal to accept that loneliness is a natural condition of modern life. A refusal to accept that young people on a bad path are finished. A refusal to accept that a rugby club's job ends when the final whistle blows on a Saturday afternoon. The shirt carried all of that in it. And Catherine, who had spent her year of recovery and her return to public life increasingly focused on this exact kind of work, the prevention of suffering before it becomes a crisis, the community infrastructure that holds people before they fall, understood what she was being given. She left Wakefield with the shirt. She left the stadium having spent the kind of afternoon that generates no single dramatic headline but leaves a dozen different people feeling something had changed. The CEO had seen his club's work recognized at the highest level. The former players had spent an afternoon in the company of someone who found their stories worth hearing. The teenagers in the dugout had sat with a woman who treated them not as a social issue but as young people in the process of becoming who they were going to be. The girls on the pitch had been told, in effect, that what they were doing there in the cold was something worth the presence of a princess. And Catherine herself had confirmed, in front of cameras that would transmit the images across the country and beyond, that the Rugby Football League's community work was not a side project. It was not the nice story you tell when the sport needs better press. It was the point. The leagues, the foundations, the programs running through schools and stadiums and community rooms across England, these were, in her exact words, absolute gold dust. That phrase, gold dust, did not come from a speechwriter. It had the texture of a live thought, something arrived at in the room rather than prepared before it. And it spread. In the hours and days after the visit, it was the phrase that journalists reached for when describing what had happened in Wakefield. Not the photographs, not the shirt, not the formal statements from the RFL and the foundation and the club. The phrase. Because it did the work that formal statements are designed to do but rarely accomplish, it named the value of something in terms that required no translation. The Wakefield Trinity Community Foundation, which had put on the afternoon's events, issued a statement through its trustee lead, Denise Teal, saying it had been an honor to welcome the princess and that it had been amazing to see her take such an active part, to be so genuinely engaged in all of the activities across the afternoon. The hope expressed was that her support would inspire others to participate in the foundation's range of community programs. That hope was not unfounded. In the wake of a visit like this, foundations see increased volunteer inquiries, increased donations, increased awareness from people who had no idea the programs existed. The visit created a visibility effect that years of local press and community outreach can rarely match. But there is a version of this story that is about more than the visibility effect. The visibility effect matters. Funding matters. Awareness matters. And yet the thing that happened on that January afternoon in Wakefield was also simpler and more personal than any of those structural outcomes. It was about the act of showing up. Of being present. Of choosing, when you could have arranged a comfortable platform engagement or a carefully staged media moment, to go instead to the rooms where the actual work was happening and sit in those rooms with the people doing the work and the people receiving it. Catherine had done this consistently since her return to public duties after her cancer treatment in 2024 and 2025. The personal experience of serious illness, of vulnerability, of dependency, of finding that recovery does not follow a straight line had made her approach to her public role more direct, less mediated, more visibly human. She had spoken about this herself, about the way illness changes what you are willing to pretend and what you no longer have the patience for. The pretending had been reduced. The presence had increased. The visits she chose, the causes she leaned into, the conversations she was willing to have in public, all of it reflected a clarity that her earlier public life, for all its genuine commitment, had not always carried. Wakefield was an example of that clarity. The causes she had engaged with over the course of that Northern England day, children recovering from trauma, elderly people battling isolation, young people at risk of losing their future before it had properly started, women and girls finding strength and community through sport, were not random selections from a diary. They formed a coherent picture of what she believed public service was for. Not the ribbon cutting, the cathedral appearances, the state occasions that mark the ceremonial rhythm of royal life. Those matter too, in their way. But these rooms, these programs, these people, this was the part of the work she was choosing with increasing deliberateness. The Wakefield Trinity visit stood for something beyond its own afternoon. It stood as evidence of what community infrastructure looks like when it works, when a sports club takes seriously its relationship to the town it represents and builds programs that reach the people nobody else is looking at. The elderly man who comes to the stadium on a Tuesday not for a match but for company. The teenage girl who discovers that her aggression has a context in which it is not a problem but an asset. The young boy who learned to manage his trauma by drumming on things that could take it, and then found a school band to take him with it. These were the stories Catherine carried with her when she left that stadium. Not as case studies. Not as examples for a speech she would give somewhere else. But as confirmation of something she had come north to find evidence of and found that the communities which hold people up are not accidental. They are built. They are tended. They require people who believe, in the face of considerable evidence to the contrary, that showing up consistently for other people is not only worthwhile but necessary. She had believed that before Wakefield. But Wakefield, with its In Touch program and its inspiring futures teenagers and its girls on a cold pitch and its former players in a warm room, had given that belief a specific address. A club shirt with Wakefield colors sat in the back of a car heading south out of Yorkshire, and, for everyone who had been in that stadium that Tuesday, something had shifted in the way things shift when the work you have been doing quietly for years gets called, finally, and publicly, by its right name. Gold dust. That was the name of it. And now everyone knew.